The rumble of motorcycles shook the quiet air of the gas station parking lot as the bikers pulled in, their engines roaring like thunder. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the empty highway, and the last few rays of daylight clung to the pavement. The gas station had seen its fair share of road-weary travelers, but tonight there was something different in the air. A crackling tension that only a group of drunk, rowdy bikers could bring. Kyle Davidson, the gas station clerk, wiped down the counter, his movements slow and methodical. His uniform was old, faded, but well worn. A name tag with his name scribbled on it in marker barely clung to his chest, and his face had seen too many nights like this to care. He'd been behind that counter for longer than he wanted to admit, working the night shift to pay bills, to keep moving from one day to the next. He wasn't bothered by the usual crowd, truckers stopping for a break, travelers filling their tanks, the occasional family coming in for snacks. But when the bikers swaggered in, things changed. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. Their laughter filled the small shop as they made their way inside. 6 men, loud and brash, strutting through the door like they owned the place. The smell of whiskey and stale cigarettes clung to them as they pulled off their leather jackets, revealing tattoos and patches that marked them as part of some club, some gang, as Kyle imagined. The leader, a burly man with a thick beard and a patch that read Razorback, led the charge. He was flanked by the others, all young, all rowdy, full of that dangerous, cocky swagger that only alcohol could fuel. Kyle didn't look up right away. He didn't need to. He had been doing this long enough to know what kind of trouble these men brought. The kind that thought they could walk into any space and take over, bullying people around just to get a rise out of them. He had dealt with drunks before, with loudmouths and troublemakers. Most of the time, they left after a few minutes of pushing and shoving, no big deal. But there was something different about tonight. Something in the way they walked in, the way they immediately started hassling the customers. They weren't just here for gas. They weren't just passing through. "Hey, buddy!" Razorback's voice boomed across the shop as he approached the counter, slapping a pack of cigarettes down with a thud. "How much for these?" His eyes lingered on Kyle, sizing him up like he was just another pushover. Kyle glanced up, his face impassive, before giving a quick professional response. $3.50. Razorback leaned across the counter, getting in Kyle's space, his breath hot and sour. "What's your problem, man? Why you look so serious?" His voice had an edge to it, rougher than necessary. "You look like you've been stuck in this dump for far too long." The other bikers, sensing an opening, crowded around the counter, snickering and egging on their leader. One of them, a skinny man with wild eyes, slapped Kyle's shoulder hard, knocking a bottle of soda from the shelf. "You need to lighten up, man. What, you scared or something?" The group laughed, their voices full of drunken amusement. Kyle's jaw clenched, but he didn't react. He was used to this. A bit of banter here and there, the usual taunts. He had learned long ago to keep his cool, not to let the noise rattle him. He had worked plenty of rough nights in places much worse than this, but something about tonight felt different. "Just here to do my job, gentlemen," Kyle said, his voice calm but firm, eyes meeting Razorback's without flinching. He didn't show fear, he never did. He knew how this game worked, but Razorback wasn't done. He wasn't getting the rise he wanted. He stepped closer, leaning in even more, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Job? What kind of job is this, huh? Sitting around, staring at your face in the mirror every day like some kind of sad sack?" The others laughed again, a few hoots echoing in the small space. Kyle didn't move. His hand rested on the counter, but his posture didn't change. He had learned to stay still, to let people like Razorback keep talking until they wore themselves out. But Razorback wasn't wearing out. He was getting closer, pushing Kyle's buttons just to see if he'd snap. He leaned in even further, his breath hot on Kyle's face. "What's the matter, old man? You too scared to fight back? We can teach you a lesson." And that's when Kyle knew this wasn't just another round of harmless teasing. This was different. They weren't leaving until they got what they wanted. They thought they could push him around. And right then, Kyle realized, he wasn't about to let that happen. Not tonight. The noise from the bikers grew louder, the air thick with their jeers, the clinking of bottles, and the echo of mocking laughter. Razorback's face was just inches away from Kyle now, his breath reeking of whiskey. His eyes narrowed in that familiar aggressive glint that usually came with alcohol-fueled bravado. Kyle could feel the heat of his gaze, the weight of the tension building in the small space between them. It wasn't just the usual harassment anymore. This was something different, something more dangerous. But Kyle didn't flinch. He didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. His eyes remained steady, his face impassive. He had dealt with worse, a lot worse. But tonight, it wasn't just about handling the drunk bikers. Something was stirring inside him, something he couldn't just push aside anymore. They had crossed a line, and now they were going to find out just how badly they had underestimated him. Razorback leaned in even closer, his hands slamming down onto the counter. "You're a tough guy, huh? I can see it in your eyes, man. What, you think you're some big shot because you sit here all day playing pretend?" He pushed harder, trying to make Kyle react, trying to see if he could break the wall of calm the clerk had built around himself. The other bikers crowded around, the scent of sweat and alcohol thick in the air, their eyes flicking between Kyle and their leader, unsure of what would happen next. One of them, a tall, wiry guy named Chuck, stepped forward, his voice slurring. "Come on, Razor, let's see what this guy's really made of." He grinned, a tooth missing in the front of his mouth, the kind of grin that came from years of starting fights and never having to finish them. But Kyle's calmness was starting to unsettle them. The more they pushed, the more they tried to provoke him, the more they felt the weight of his silence hanging in the air. They expected a reaction, a fight, a shout, anything. But Kyle wasn't playing their game, and that was what made it worse. "Do you know who you're messing with?" Kyle said, his voice low but steady, each word deliberate. The words hung in the air for a moment, and the room went quiet. Razorback blinked, clearly thrown off by the sudden shift in Kyle's tone. The others stopped, their faces now just a little more uncertain, like they were hearing something they didn't quite understand. For a moment, there was only silence. The sound of the fridge humming, the soft whir of the lights overhead, the distant hum of cars on the highway outside. Kyle looked at Razorback, his eyes unwavering, his expression unreadable. "Is that a threat, old man?" Razorback's voice shook slightly, the bravado slipping just a little. Kyle's hand, which had been resting on the counter, tightened around a half-empty soda bottle. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. But Razorback wasn't the type to back down. He was too far gone in his drunken arrogance to know when to stop. "You really want to find out?" Kyle asked, his tone colder now, like the calm before the storm. There was a beat of hesitation. Razorback's hand twitched at his side, and Kyle saw the movement, saw the way his fingers hovered near his waistband, where a knife was probably tucked. The air seemed to shift, and the bikers sensed it too. The small, quiet man behind the counter wasn't what they had expected. Kyle was no longer just a gas station clerk, and they were starting to realize that now. Before anyone could make another move, Kyle's hand snapped out, fast as lightning, grabbing Razorback's wrist in a vice-like grip, twisting it just enough to make him gasp in pain. The force behind the move was shocking, and the gang froze. Razorback tried to pull away, but Kyle's grip was unyielding. "Don't make me repeat myself," Kyle said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a man who had been through far worse than these bikers could ever imagine. "I don't want any trouble, but if you insist, I'll finish it." Razorback gritted his teeth, trying to wrestle free, but it was clear he wasn't going anywhere. The grip Kyle had on him wasn't the grip of a man who had only been lifting boxes at a gas station. It was the grip of someone who had seen combat, who had been trained for situations just like this. A Delta Force operator, a ghost in the night, disavowed and forgotten by the world, but never truly leaving the skills behind. The bikers started to back up, confusion mixing with fear. Chuck tried to step forward, his bravado quickly dissolving. "You're crazy, man," he muttered, glancing over at the rest of his gang, unsure if they should keep going or cut their losses. But it was too late now. Kyle's calm demeanor, the tight grip, the authority in his voice, everything about him screamed that he wasn't someone to be messed with. "You don't know me, but you'll remember me," Kyle said, his voice hardening. "Now get out." Razorback, sweating and desperate, nodded weakly, his face contorting with pain as Kyle released his grip and shoved him back. The bikers hesitated for a split second before turning and scrambling out of the gas station, not a word passing between them as they rushed to their bikes. The roar of their engines echoed in the night, But this time, it was retreating. It wasn't the sound of dominance. It was the sound of men who had been put in their place, the sound of defeat. Kyle stood behind the counter, his hand still clenched for a moment, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He didn't let it show, but his heart was beating a little faster now. The bikers were gone. The tension had broken. And for the first time in years, Kyle felt a shift inside himself. Like the man he had been, the soldier he had buried, had finally found his place again. The gas station was quiet once more. The regular hum of the lights, the distant traffic, the soft whoosh of the cooler doors. But this time, Kyle wasn't just the clerk. He wasn't just the man who cleaned counters and sold snacks. For a moment, he had been someone else, someone who knew how to handle the chaos, how to control the room with nothing but silence and strength. He glanced at the door, hearing the fading roar of their engines in the distance. The town was quiet again, and the world outside hadn't changed. But Kyle knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just a forgotten man behind the counter. Not anymore. The silence lingered in the air long after the last of the bikers' engines faded into the distance. Kyle stood motionless behind the counter, his eyes locked on the door, watching as if waiting for something to happen. His pulse had slowed, the adrenaline of the confrontation settling into a heavy calm. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel victorious. It was a feeling he had long buried deep inside, a feeling that came with the past, the man he used to be. His hands shook slightly as he wiped down the counter, his motions mechanical, like he had done 1,000 times before. The flickering light above his head hummed quietly, almost as if trying to fill the empty space where the bikers' loud laughter and insults had once echoed. But now, everything was still, too still. It wasn't until the door opened again, the bell above it jingling softly, that Kyle looked up. A lone figure stepped inside, a young woman, perhaps in her 20s, with wild red hair and tired eyes. She wore a denim jacket, a few patches of her own on the sleeves, and a look of quiet determination as she stepped toward the counter. Kyle gave her a nod, not saying anything. She was a regular, someone who stopped in occasionally for a pack of smokes or a quick drink before heading out. He had seen her before, knew her type, the kind of traveler who was always in a hurry, always somewhere else. She didn't ask questions, and Kyle didn't offer answers. It was an unspoken understanding between them. She approached the counter, glancing at the spot where the bikers had been just moments ago. "Looks like you had a bit of fun while I was out there," she said dryly, a faint smile playing at the corner of her lips. Kyle gave a half smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for the cigarettes she wanted, sliding the pack across the counter without a word. He didn't know how to explain what had just happened, didn't even know if he wanted to. The events of the last few minutes still felt like they were wrapped in a haze, like he had somehow stepped outside himself and watched the whole thing unfold from a distance. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice softer now, her eyes narrowing with concern as she studied him. Kyle's gaze shifted back to the door, to the empty parking lot outside. The night had already swallowed the bikers, and the hum of the highway seemed distant, like it belonged to someone else. He took a deep breath, running a hand over his face. "Yeah, everything's fine." She didn't buy it. She could tell something had shifted, something had broken in the silence between them. Her gaze flicked from his face to his hands, which were still slightly trembling, the faintest hint of tension in his shoulders. "You sure?" she pressed, her voice quieter now, more insistent. "I've never seen you like that before. You don't usually let people walk all over you, but..." She trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. Kyle's eyes locked with hers, his gaze steady but distant. There was a moment of hesitation, like he was trying to decide whether or not to share a piece of himself, a part of the life he had left behind. But then, he sighed, dropping his gaze to the counter again, his fingers idly tracing the edge of the register. "You don't really know me," Kyle said, his voice barely above a whisper. He paused, the words hanging between them. "I used to do things, bad things, things I had to leave behind. But sometimes, people don't let you forget." She stood still, watching him, as if waiting for him to say more. Kyle had always kept to himself. He had never opened up about his past, not to anyone. But something about that moment, something about the way she was looking at him, made him feel like maybe, just maybe, it was okay to say just a little bit more. "I was in Delta Force," he muttered, his voice low, as if saying it out loud made it more real. I was trained for situations like that, but I walked away, got out of the game." He shrugged, the motion small, almost defeated. "Sometimes it catches up with you. People think because you're here, working at a gas station, you're just another regular guy. They don't know who you really are." Her expression softened, the quiet understanding in her eyes showing that she wasn't just listening to his words, she was seeing him, all of him. She stepped a little closer, not out of pity, but out of a silent empathy, the kind that only someone who had been through their own battles could understand. "You're not the man you were back then," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "And you don't have to prove anything to anyone, but you can't let them think they can walk all over you either. You've got a right to stand your ground." Kyle met her eyes, a flicker of something, maybe appreciation, maybe regret, crossing his face. He had been hiding for so long, trying to blend into the background of this quiet town, trying to forget the man he had been, but the world didn't let you forget. It never did. She paid for her cigarettes, her expression thoughtful. When she turned to leave, she glanced back over her shoulder at him. "You're not just the guy behind the counter, Kyle," she said softly. "And I think you should remember that. You're more than that." As the door closed behind her, the bell jingled softly, and Kyle was left standing in the quiet of the gas station once more. The soft hum of the lights filled the empty space, the evening's events still echoing in his mind. The bikers were gone, but the feeling of their presence lingered in the air, like an old wound that refused to heal. Kyle stood there for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the parking lot outside, where the last rays of the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only the darkness behind. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or the day after that. He didn't know if he would stay here forever or move on. But in that moment, he realized something. He didn't need to hide anymore. He didn't need to pretend to be someone he wasn't. The past was behind him, but it had shaped him into the man he was today. And if anyone tried to push him again, they'd find out just how far he was willing to go to defend the peace he had earned. For the first time in a long while, Kyle felt like he had control. He didn't have to run anymore, and that, in itself, was enough. The stillness of the night wrapped around the gas station like a blanket, thick and suffocating. The only sounds that punctuated the silence were the distant hum of cars on the highway, the low buzz of the flickering light overhead, and the soft clink of coins as Kyle counted the evening's earnings. He wasn't in a hurry. There was no rush, no urgency to anything anymore. The bikers were gone, and the night had returned to its usual rhythm, as though the chaos never even happened. But for Kyle, the events of the past hour kept replaying in his mind like a loop he couldn't break. The confrontation, the bikers' taunts, the broken bottle, the strange, visceral sense of power that had surged through him when he finally stood his ground. It was a part of him he had buried so long ago, a side of him he thought he had lost when he walked away from the life of a soldier. But it had resurfaced, uninvited. And now it sat quietly in the back of his mind, making itself known. He exhaled deeply, rubbing his hands together, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled into his bones. The biker leader had been right about one thing. Kyle had changed. He wasn't just the guy behind the counter anymore. He wasn't just some washed-up soldier working a dead-end job. He was a man who had seen too much and walked away. But now, he was starting to realize that the past didn't leave you behind so easily. It clung to you, followed you in ways you couldn't escape, even if you tried. The door swung open again, and the sharp jingle of the bell cut through the quiet. Kyle didn't look up at first, thinking it was just another customer coming in for gas or snacks. But then, he heard the familiar sound of boots against the floor, the shuffle of a heavier step. He glanced up, his eyes meeting the gaze of Sheriff Harris, a man Kyle had known for years. The sheriff wasn't a stranger to the station, usually coming by for a coffee or a quick chat. But tonight, there was something different in his demeanor, something that made Kyle sit up a little straighter, his instincts prickling at the back of his neck. Harris didn't waste time with pleasantries. He walked straight up to the counter, his face grim, his eyes scanning Kyle as if weighing something. "You doing all right, Kyle?" The question was simple, but it carried weight. It was the kind of question a man asked when he knew something had gone down, even if he hadn't been there to see it. Kyle set down the register drawer with a soft thud, wiping his hands on the apron. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady. He wasn't sure if he was trying to convince the sheriff or himself. Harris nodded slowly, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Saw the bikers leave. They didn't look too happy. You want to talk about it? Kyle's gaze shifted toward the door, his thoughts momentarily drifting back to the confrontation. He could still feel the tension in the air, the sound of their boots scraping against the floor, the mocking laughs, the sudden weight of his own silence. But none of that mattered now. They were gone, and the only thing left to do was move forward. I handled it, Kyle said, his tone flat. It wasn't a big deal. Harris didn't buy it. His eyes narrowed as he leaned against the counter. I've seen you handle yourself before, but something tells me this was different. Those bikers are troublemakers, no doubt, but they know better than to pick fights with people who can fight back. They're not the type to leave without a reason. Kyle sighed and rubbed his forehead, trying to find the right words. The sheriff was right. It had been different, the way he had handled it, the way he had stood his ground. Not out of anger, but out of something deeper, something buried. He had learned the hard way that fighting wasn't about power, it was about control. I didn't want to fight them, Kyle said, his voice softer now, but I had to make them understand that they couldn't push me around. I didn't ask for it, but sometimes you have to remind people that you're not as easy a target as they think. Harris studied him for a long moment, his face unreadable. You still haven't answered my question, Kyle. Why now? Why after all this time? He paused, his voice dropping lower, almost as if speaking to himself. What made you snap? The question hung in the air, heavier than any of the taunts or threats the bikers had made. Kyle could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, making him rethink everything that had happened. It wasn't just about those bikers. It wasn't even about the life he had left behind. It was about something much bigger. The years he had spent hiding, running from his past, from the man he used to be. He leaned against the counter, his eyes fixed on the empty parking lot outside. I've spent so many years running from who I used to be, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But you can't outrun it forever. The past doesn't let you go that easy. He paused, his fingers tapping lightly on the counter. Maybe I just needed to remind myself of that. Harris was quiet for a long moment, his gaze softening as he took in Kyle's words. There were no more questions, no more probing, just understanding, unspoken but clear. Harris had seen enough to know when a man had been through hell and back, when he was carrying a weight that no one else could see. He wasn't about to pry any further. Just make sure you don't carry it too far, all right? The sheriff said after a beat, his voice quiet but firm. The world has a way of turning on you when you least expect it, and sometimes it's not worth proving anything to anyone. Kyle nodded, appreciating the sheriff's concern, but knowing there was no easy way out of this. I'll keep that in mind. With a final look at Kyle, Harris turned and walked toward the door. You've got yourself a quiet night ahead of you, he said over his shoulder, his voice light. Just don't make a habit of stirring up trouble. Kyle watched as the sheriff left, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft jingle. He stood there for a while, thinking about the way the sheriff had looked at him, the understanding in his eyes. It wasn't pity. It was more like a recognition of something Kyle had tried to bury for too long. The night stretched on, still and quiet, as Kyle continued his work behind the counter. The minutes passed like hours, but he didn't feel the weight of time pressing on him. There were no more bikers, no more threats, just the hum of the lights above him and the distant sound of cars on the highway. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that this was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when he finally stopped running. The moment when he finally stopped pretending to be someone he wasn't. And as the night wore on, Kyle felt something inside him settle, something that had been lost for a long time, something he hadn't realized he had been searching for all along. Peace,